It begins much earlier than most people think, long before labels like Muslim, Christian, or Jewish were ever used, long before communities formed around names and identities. It begins with a single idea, a single belief that there is one God, one Creator, and that humanity is connected to that Creator through guidance. And this is where the story truly starts, not with division but with origin, with a shared beginning that is often forgotten when people focus only on what came later. At the center of this beginning is a figure known across all three traditions, Ibrahim, also known as Abraham, peace be upon him, a man remembered not just as a historical figure but as a symbol of pure belief, someone who turned away from everything else and chose to believe in one God even when it required sacrifice, even when it meant standing alone. And that decision became the foundation of something much greater than a single life. It became the beginning of a path. From that point, guidance did not stop. It continued through prophets, through messages, through reminders sent to humanity across time. And this is another connection that is often overlooked, because all three traditions believe that God guided people, that He did not leave humanity without direction. And names like Musa, known as Moses, appear across all three, as do many others, forming a shared history rather than separate ones. And even Isa, known as Jesus, is central in Christianity and Islam and recognized within the broader prophetic narrative in Judaism, showing that these are not isolated stories but connected chapters of a larger message that continued through generations. The purpose of these prophets remained consistent: to guide people back to one God, to remind them of truth, to call them toward a life built on faith, justice, and responsibility. And while the core message remained the same, the way it was preserved, practiced, and understood began to take on different forms over time, not suddenly, not through a single event, but gradually, shaped by human experience, by culture, by language, and by the way communities formed around the guidance they received. In the earliest stage, there was no clear division of identity. There were simply believers, people who followed guidance and tried to live according to it. And the distinctions we recognize today had not yet formed. They developed later as history unfolded, as communities expanded, and as different interpretations began to settle into structured traditions. And this is why understanding the beginning matters, because it shows us something deeper than difference. It shows us connection. As time moved forward, the message continued to travel through people and across regions, but human societies are not static. They change, they grow, they adapt. And with that change, the way faith is expressed also evolves. The core belief may remain constant, but the details around it begin to differ. And this is where the paths slowly begin to separate, not as a break, but as a gradual movement in different directions shaped by interpretation, by experience, and by the way each community preserved what it had received. Yet even as these paths began to form, the origin remained the same: one God, one beginning, one foundation. And this is not a small detail, it is the most important part of the story, because when we understand that the roots are shared, we begin to see that what came later is not about completely different truths, but about different journeys that grew from the same source. And that understanding changes everything. Because when we look at the beginning, we do not see division, we see unity, we see a shared belief, a shared direction, a shared origin that connects everything before it separates. And that is the perspective we carry forward into the next part of the story, not asking how they are different first, but understanding how they began as one. As time moved forward from that shared beginning, something gradual began to take shape, not a sudden split, not a clear division, but a slow and almost unnoticeable shift in how different communities carried the same message forward. Because history does not usually change direction in a single moment, it moves step by step, shaped by people, by events, and by the way those events are remembered and passed on. And this is where the paths that began from one origin slowly started to move in different directions, not because the foundation changed, but because the way that foundation was understood and preserved began to vary across time and place. In the earliest generations, the message was still close to its source. Guidance was still connected to those who had directly received it, and the understanding of faith was still anchored in that direct connection. But as generations passed, that direct connection naturally became more distant. and with distance came interpretation, explanation, and the need to organize and preserve what had been given in ways that future generations could understand. Communities began to form around shared understandings, not as a rejection of others, but as a natural result of people holding on to what they had learned in the way that made sense to them, and this is where difference begins to take shape, not as conflict but as perspective, because when people receive the same message in different environments, in different cultures and through different teachers, the way they express and structure that message can begin to vary, even when the core remains the same. Language played a role in this process because as the message spread beyond its original setting, it moved into new regions where people spoke differently, thought differently, and lived differently, and translation itself is not always exact. It carries interpretation within it, it carries emphasis, it carries the way meaning is understood by those who are receiving it, and over time, these small differences in understanding begin to accumulate. At the same time, leadership and authority began to shape how communities developed, because after the era of direct guidance, people naturally looked towards scholars, teachers, and leaders to help them understand their faith, and those figures played a major role in how teachings were preserved and explained. But no two individuals are exactly the same, each brings their own perspective, their own method, their own way of organizing knowledge, and when their teachings are passed on, those methods begin to form structured approaches that later generations follow. This does not mean the message itself changed, but the way it was approached became more defined within each community, and over time, these structured approaches began to form distinct paths of learning. History itself also played a powerful role because events leave impact, and impact shapes memory, and memory shapes identity, and as different communities experienced different historical moments, the way they understood their past began to differ. Some events were emphasized more in certain places, while others were remembered differently elsewhere, and over time, these differences in memory became part of how people understood their faith, not just as belief but as history, as identity, as something connected to who they are and where they come from. This is how something that begins as a shared story can slowly become multiple narratives, not because the origin changed, but because the journey took different paths. It is also important to understand that difference is not always intentional. It is often the result of time, because when something is carried across generations, it is shaped by those who carry it, by how they explain it, by what they emphasize, by what they prioritize, and by the challenges they face in their own time, and this means that each generation adds a layer, sometimes small, sometimes significant, but always contributing to how the message is understood in that moment. Over centuries, these layers build upon each other until they form something that feels established, something that feels distinct, even though it began from the same source. Another factor that influenced this process was the way knowledge was collected and preserved, because in order to maintain guidance, communities developed systems of recording, teaching, and transmitting knowledge, and while the intention was always preservation, the method could differ. Some prioritized certain sources, others emphasized different collections, and over time, these choices shaped how people learned and understood their faith, not in contradiction but in variation, and that variation became part of identity. This is where we begin to see that difference is not always about opposing ideas, it can also be about different methods of preserving the same truth. As these differences became more structured, they also became more visible, not necessarily through conflict, but through expression, through the way people practiced, through the way they taught, through the way they explained their beliefs to others, and for those within each community, these expressions felt natural, they felt correct, they felt like the continuation of what they had received, and over time, they became part of how people define themselves, not just as believers but as members of a specific tradition within a larger faith. Yet even as these paths continued to develop, something remained unchanged beneath everything else. The belief in one God, the idea of divine guidance, the respect for prophets, the sense of accountability, these were constants. They did not shift, they did not divide, they remained at the center of everything, even as the layers around them grew more complex. This is what makes this stage of the story so important, because it shows that difference does not erase connection, it exists alongside it, it grows around it, but it does not replace it. When we look at this process carefully, we begin to understand that the paths did not separate because the truth itself changed, they separated because human experience shaped how that truth was carried forward, and human experience is never identical across all places and all times. It is influenced by culture, by language, by history, by leadership, and by the challenges each community faces, and this means that variation is almost inevitable when something is carried across generations and across regions. This understanding changes how we see difference because instead of viewing it as a break, we begin to see it as a development, as something that grew over time, something that was shaped gradually, something that reflects the journey rather than contradicting the origin. And when we see it this way, the story becomes less about separation and more about process, less about conflict and more about understanding how faith moves through time. As the generations continued, these structured paths became more established. They became part of education, part of tradition, part of how people learned from a young age, and once something becomes part of tradition, it is no longer questioned in the same way, it is accepted, it is followed, it becomes part of identity. And this is how differences that began as subtle variations eventually become clear distinctions that people recognize and live by. But even at this stage, it is important to remember that the origin has not disappeared. It is still there, beneath every layer, beneath every interpretation, beneath every tradition, and it continues to connect everything, even when it is not always the focus. The story has grown more complex, more detailed, more layered, but it has not lost its beginning, and that beginning still holds the key to understanding everything that came after. Because when we recognize that the paths began from the same source, we begin to approach the differences with a different mindset, not as something that separates completely, but as something that developed over time, shaped by human experience, shaped by history, shaped by the way each community carried the message forward, and that perspective allows us to move into the next part of the story with clarity, understanding not just that the paths are different, but how and why they became that. As these paths continued to develop over time, the differences that once existed quietly in the background began to take on clearer form, not because the foundation changed, but because the layers built upon it became more defined, more structured, and more visible in everyday life. And this stage of the story is where understanding becomes deeper, because it is no longer only about how things began or how they slowly separated, it is about how those differences are expressed, how they are lived, and how they are understood by the people who carry them forward. When something is practiced daily, when it becomes part of routine, part of identity, part of community, it naturally feels more significant, and this is how subtle variations can grow into clearly recognizable distinctions, not through conflict, but through repetition and continuity. One of the ways this became visible was through practice, through the way people expressed their belief in daily life, because faith is not only something that is believed, it is something that is lived, and when it is lived in slightly different ways across different communities, those differences begin to stand out, even when they are built on the same foundation. Acts of worship, for example, may carry small variations in how they are performed, not in their purpose, but in their expression, and for those within each tradition, these expressions feel natural, they feel correct. They feel like the continuation of what has been taught and preserved over generations. At the same time, education played a major role in shaping how these differences were understood, because each community developed its own way of teaching, its own way of explaining, its own way of organizing knowledge, and when people learn within a specific framework from a young age, that framework becomes their lens, the way they see and understand everything else, and this is not something unusual. It is how human learning works. We understand through what we are taught, and what we are taught shapes how we interpret the world around us. Over time, these educational structures became more established, more refined, and more influential, reinforcing the paths that had already begun to form. Memory also played a powerful role because what communities choose to remember and emphasize becomes part of how they define themselves, and historical events are not only recorded, they are felt, they are remembered with meaning, and that meaning is passed down, shaping how future generations understand their past. Some events are remembered with a focus on unity, others with a focus on struggle, others with a focus on lessons, and these different emphases do not necessarily contradict each other, but they create different perspectives, different emotional connections to the same history. Over time, these perspectives began to shape identity more clearly, not just in belief but in how people saw themselves within the larger story, and this is where identity becomes layered. It is no longer only about faith, it is also about belonging, about tradition, about continuity, and when identity reaches this level, it becomes more defined, more visible, more structured. What was once a subtle difference in understanding becomes a clear distinction in identity, not because the core has changed but because the layers around it have become stronger. Another important aspect of this stage is how communities interact with each other, because difference is not only shaped internally, it is also shaped by how people see one another, and perception plays a powerful role here, because what we notice often becomes what we focus on, and when people see differences, they can sometimes appear larger than they actually are, especially when they are not understood within their full context. This is where misunderstanding can begin, not necessarily from intention, but from limited perspective, from seeing only the surface without understanding the depth behind it. Yet even with all of these developments, something remains constant, something that does not change even as everything else evolves, and that is the core belief, the connection to one God, the recognition of divine guidance, the respect for the message that was carried through generations. These are not elements that shift or divide, they remain central, they remain shared, they remain the foundation that everything else is built upon. This is what makes this stage so important to understand, because it shows that difference does not replace unity, it exists alongside it, it grows around it, but it does not remove it. When we look at this process closely, we begin to see that what appears as separation is often complexity, layers built over time, shaped by human experience, shaped by the way communities live, learn, and remember, and this understanding allows us to approach the story with more depth, with more awareness, because it moves us away from simple explanations and toward a more complete picture. It is also important to recognize that difference is not always something negative, it can also be a reflection of diversity, of the many ways people connect with the same truth, and while these ways may not look identical, they are still connected to the same source, still rooted in the same origin that began everything. This does not mean that all differences are the same, but it does mean that they should be understood within the context of their development, not isolated from it. As generations continued to pass, these distinctions became more normalized, more accepted, more integrated into daily life, and once something becomes part of daily life, it becomes part of identity, something that is not constantly questioned but simply lived. This is how traditions are formed, how they are preserved, how they are passed on, and how they continue to exist across time. But even at this stage, the connection to the origin remains, even if it is not always the focus, it is still present, still underlying everything, still connecting what may appear different on the surface. And this is what allows us to understand that the story is not one of complete separation, but one of development, of layers, of perspectives that grew over time while remaining connected to the same beginning. Because when we look beyond what is visible, beyond the differences that stand out, we begin to see something deeper, something that has been there from the very start, a shared foundation that continues to exist, even as the paths that grew from it became more defined, more structured, and more visible in the lives of those who follow them. And understanding this stage prepares us for what comes next, because once we see how differences are expressed and how they become part of identity, we can begin to look at them with clarity, not as something that erases connection, but as something that exists within it, shaped by time, shaped by experience, and shaped by the way each community continues to carry the message forward. As these differences became more visible in everyday life, they were no longer something hidden within history or understood only by scholars, they became part of what people could see, hear, and experience directly, and this is where perception begins to play a powerful role, because what we see often shapes what we believe, and when differences are visible, they can sometimes appear larger than they actually are, especially when they are not understood within their full context. For many people, the first encounter with these differences is not through deep study or historical understanding, but through observation, through noticing how others worship, how they speak about faith, how they practice, and how they express their beliefs in daily life, and without context, these visible distinctions can feel like fundamental differences rather than variations built on a shared foundation. One of the most noticeable areas where this becomes clear is in acts of worship, because worship is something that is repeated regularly, something that is deeply personal yet publicly visible, and when it is performed in slightly different ways across different communities, those differences naturally stand out. The structure of prayer, the words that are emphasized, the way certain moments are observed, these can vary in detail, not in purpose but in expression, and for someone looking from the outside, these differences can seem more significant than they actually are, simply because they are visible and repeated. At the same time, there are differences in how religious texts are approached and understood, not in their existence but in interpretation, in emphasis, in the way they are explained and taught. Over time, communities have developed their own traditions of learning, their own methods of understanding, and these methods shape how people connect with their faith. Some may focus more on certain teachings, others may highlight different aspects, and these choices influence how belief is expressed in practice. Again, this is not about contradiction but about variation in approach, shaped by history, by scholarship, and by the needs of each community. Cultural influence also plays a role in how these differences appear, because faith does not exist in isolation. It exists within societies, within cultures, within environments that shape how people live and interact. And as the message spread across different regions, it naturally adapted to different cultural contexts, not in its core but in its expression. This means that what people see as difference is sometimes not only about belief, but also about culture, about tradition, about the way communities have lived over generations, and when culture and faith blend, it can become difficult to separate what is essential from what is contextual. Another important aspect of this stage is how people interpret what they see, because perception is not always neutral. It is shaped by what we already know, by what we have been taught, by what we expect to see, and this means that two people can observe the same practice and understand it in completely different ways, depending on their perspective. This is where misunderstanding can grow, not from intention but from lack of context, from seeing the surface without understanding the depth behind it. In many cases, what appears as a major difference is actually built on a shared intention, a shared belief expressed in slightly different ways, and when that intention is understood, the difference begins to feel less like a separation and more like a variation, something that exists within a larger unity rather than outside of it. But without that understanding, the difference can feel larger, more distant, more defining than it actually is. It is also important to recognize that identity plays a strong role in this stage, because once practices and perspectives become part of how people define themselves, they are no longer just actions. They become symbols of belonging, of tradition, of continuity, and when something becomes part of identity, it is naturally held more strongly, more carefully, and sometimes more defensively. This is not unique to religion, it is part of human nature. People protect what they feel connected to, what they feel represents who they are. Yet even within this strong sense of identity, the shared foundation remains present, even if it is not always the focus. The belief in one God, the idea of guidance, the connection to something greater than oneself, these remain central, they remain unchanged, they remain the thread that connects everything, even when the expressions around them differ. When we step back and look at this stage clearly, we begin to understand that what people see today is not the full story, it is only the surface, the visible layer of something much deeper, something shaped by history, by learning, by culture, and by the way communities have carried their faith through time. And when we focus only on the surface, we risk misunderstanding the whole. Because the surface shows difference, but the depth shows connection. And understanding requires looking beyond what is immediately visible. This is where perspective becomes important, because the same reality can be seen in different ways depending on how we approach it. If we approach it with curiosity, with a desire to understand, we begin to see the layers, the history, the shared foundation that connects everything. But if we approach it with assumption, with judgment, we see only the difference, and that difference becomes the entire story. The truth, however, is more balanced. It is not only about what separates. It is also about what connects. And in many cases, what connects is far greater than what separates, even if it is less visible at first glance. As we move through this stage, it becomes clear that the visible differences are only one part of the story. They are the result of a long process. A process that began with a shared origin and developed over time through human experience, through interpretation, through culture, and through the way each community continued to live and express its faith. And when we understand that, we begin to see that difference is not the beginning of the story, and it is not the end of it either. It is simply one layer within a much larger narrative, a narrative that still holds a shared foundation beneath everything else, a foundation that continues to exist, even when it is not always the focus. Because beyond what is seen, beyond what is practiced, beyond what is emphasized, there is still something that connects everything back to where it began, something that remains unchanged, something that continues to exist beneath every difference, quietly holding the story together. As the story reaches this stage, the focus begins to shift in a more meaningful way, because after understanding the origin, the gradual development, and the visible expressions of difference, there comes a moment where the attention naturally turns towards something deeper, something that has been present from the very beginning but is often overlooked when people focus only on what separates. And that is the question of what still connects everything together despite all the layers that have formed over time. When this question is asked with sincerity, without the intention to compare or judge, the answer begins to reveal itself clearly, because the connections that remain are not small or secondary, they are fundamental, they are the core, they are the very essence of what defines these traditions at their deepest level. Across all differences, across all perspectives, across all interpretations, there is one belief that remains central, the belief in one God, one Creator, one ultimate source of existence. And this is not a detail that exists on the surface, it is the foundation upon which everything else is built. And no matter how history unfolded, no matter how communities developed, this belief has remained unchanged, carried through generations, held within hearts, expressed in different ways but never replaced or removed. This belief creates a connection that is deeper than any visible difference, because it speaks to the same understanding of existence, the same recognition of something greater, the same relationship between the human and the divine. There is also a shared sense of guidance, the idea that humanity is not left without direction, that throughout history, guidance has been given in different forms, through prophets, through messages, through reminders that call people back to truth, to justice, to responsibility, and while the details of that guidance may be understood differently across traditions, the concept itself remains the same, the belief that life is not without purpose, that there is a moral direction, that there is accountability beyond the immediate world, and this shared understanding creates a connection that goes beyond specific interpretations. Another point of connection lies in the values that are emphasized, because when we look beyond differences in expression, we begin to see that many of the core values remain aligned, values such as honesty, compassion, justice, responsibility, care for others, and a sense of accountability for one's actions. And these values are not tied to a single tradition alone, they appear across all three, shaping how people are taught to live, how they are encouraged to treat others, and how they understand their role in the world. These shared values reflect something deeper than variation. They reflect a common moral foundation that continues to exist across different paths. There is also a shared sense of history, even if it is understood in different ways, because the stories of prophets, the idea of revelation, the connection to a divine message, these are not separate ideas, they are interconnected. They form a larger narrative that stretches across time, linking different traditions through common figures, common themes, and a shared sense of purpose. Even when these stories are told differently or emphasized differently, the presence of those connections remains, reminding us that the roots of these traditions are not isolated, but intertwined. When we take a step back and look at all of this together, the picture becomes clearer. What connects is not small, it is not secondary, it is central, it is foundational, It is the part of the story that existed before any differences appeared and that continues to exist despite them. The differences that people often focus on are real, they exist, they have developed over time, but they exist around this core, not in place of it, and understanding this changes how we see everything else. Because when the focus shifts toward what connects, the story begins to feel different. It becomes less about separation and more about shared meaning, less about contrast and more about connection. And this does not require ignoring differences, it requires understanding their place within a larger context, recognizing that they are part of the story but not the whole story. There is also an important lesson in this stage, one that goes beyond history and into the present, because the way we choose to see these connections and differences is not determined by the past alone, it is shaped by our perspective, by how we approach the subject, by whether we seek to understand or simply to categorize. The same facts can lead to different outcomes depending on how they are approached. They can lead to respect or to division, to curiosity or to judgment, and that choice belongs to us. Understanding connection does not mean erasing difference, it means placing it in the right perspective. It means recognizing that unity does not require sameness, that people can share a foundation while expressing it in different ways, and that this diversity of expression does not necessarily weaken the connection. It can also reflect the complexity of human experience, the many ways people relate to the same truth. As this stage unfolds, it becomes clear that what has always connected these traditions is stronger than what appears to separate them, even if it is less visible, even if it requires more effort to recognize, because it exists at a deeper level, a level that is not always immediately seen but is always present. This is why returning to the foundation is so important, because it reminds us of what has never changed, what has remained constant, what continues to connect everything despite the layers that have formed over time. And when we understand this, the story reaches a point where it is no longer only about how things began or how they developed, it becomes about how we choose to see them now, whether we focus on the differences that are visible or the connections that are foundational, whether we approach the subject with openness or with assumption, and that choice shapes the meaning we take from the entire story. Because in the end, what remains is not only the history of difference, but the reality of connection, a connection that has existed from the very beginning, that has continued through time, and that still exists beneath every layer, quietly holding everything together, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be understood, waiting to be seen not as something secondary, but as something essential. As the journey reaches its final stage, the focus is no longer only on understanding the past, but on how that understanding shapes the present. Because after exploring the shared origin, the gradual development, the visible differences, and the deeper connections, there comes a point where everything comes together into a single realization, a realization that is not complicated but often overlooked, and that is the fact that these traditions, despite their differences, are still connected in ways that are far deeper than what is seen on the surface, and recognizing that connection is not just about knowledge, it is about perspective, about how we choose to see the story as a whole. When we look back at everything that has been explored, it becomes clear that the beginning was shared, that the foundation was one, that the belief in one God stood at the center of everything, and that this belief was carried forward through generations, through different communities, through different interpretations, but never replaced, never removed, never lost, and this alone changes how we understand the entire journey, because it shows that what came later did not erase what came first. It only added layers to it. Those layers, shaped by time, by history, by culture, and by human experience, created differences that became more visible, more structured, more defined, and over time, those differences became part of identity, part of tradition, part of how people understood themselves and others. But even as these identities became stronger, the foundation beneath them remained unchanged, still connecting everything back to its origin, still holding the entire structure together. This is where perspective becomes everything, because the same reality can be seen in two very different ways. It can be seen as a story of division, where differences are placed at the center and everything else fades into the background, or it can be seen as a story of connection, where the shared foundation is recognized first, and the differences are understood as part of a larger process, not the defining element of it, and the choice between these two perspectives is not made by history. It is made by those who are looking at it. Understanding does not come from ignoring differences, and it does not come from exaggerating them either. It comes from placing them in the right context, from recognizing that they developed over time, that they were shaped by human experience, that they reflect the journey rather than contradict the origin, and when we understand this, the story becomes clearer, more balanced, more complete. There is also a deeper lesson in this final stage, one that goes beyond the specific traditions being discussed and speaks to something more universal, and that is how human beings relate to difference itself, because difference exists in many forms, not only in religion but in culture, in language, in perspective, and the way we respond to difference often determines whether it becomes a source of understanding or a source of division, and this is not something that belongs to the past, it is something that continues in the present. When difference is approached with curiosity, with humility, with a willingness to understand, it becomes an opportunity to learn, to grow, to see the world in a more complete way, but when it is approached with assumption, with judgment, with a desire to separate, it becomes a barrier, something that creates distance even where connection exists, and this is why perspective matters so much, because it shapes not only how we understand history but how we interact with the present. The story that began with a shared belief in one God did not end in complete separation. It evolved, it expanded, it developed into different paths, but those paths still trace back to the same origin, they still carry elements of that original message, they still reflect the same fundamental understanding of existence, even if expressed in different ways, and recognizing this does not erase difference, it places it within a larger context, a context that allows for both understanding and respect. As everything comes together, the most important realization is not about identifying what is different, but about understanding what has always remained constant, because what remains constant is what defines the foundation, it is what connects everything across time, across place, across perspective, and when we hold on to that, the story no longer feels fragmented, it feels complete. This is why the final message is not about comparison, it is not about deciding which path is right or wrong, it is about understanding the journey as a whole, seeing how it began, how it developed, and how it continues, and recognizing that within that journey, there is both diversity and unity, both variation and connection, both difference and shared meaning. Because in the end, what matters most is not only what separates but what connects, not only what is visible but what lies beneath, not only the paths that have formed, but the origin they all trace back to. And when that is understood, the story transforms, it becomes less about division and more about awareness, less about separation and more about perspective. And perhaps that is the point where everything becomes clear, that the same belief still calls to the same truth, that the same idea of guidance still points toward meaning, that the same search for purpose still exists in every heart that seeks it, and that despite all the layers that have formed over time, the connection has never truly disappeared, it has only become less visible to those who look only at the surface. But for those who look deeper, for those who seek to understand rather than to divide, that connection is still there, still present, still strong, and it continues to remind us that what began as one has never been completely lost, it has only taken different forms along the way. And in that realization, the question changes, it is no longer about why they are different, it becomes about how they are still connected. And that is the understanding that remains when everything else has been explored, the understanding that brings the entire story back to where it began, not in separation, but in a shared foundation that continues to exist quietly, consistently, and meaningfully beneath everything else.